It was supposed to be a peaceful day in the neighborhood. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and a family was excited to begin their new life in a quiet, suburban community. But this morning was different. For the Thomas family, everything was about to change. The family, a black couple with 2 young children, had just moved into a beautiful home in the neighborhood. They were happy and excited about their new life, hoping to make friends and build a future. It wasn't their first day in the neighborhood, but it felt like it was the start of something special. As they unpacked boxes and settled into their new home, they had no idea that there was someone nearby who already had a problem with them. Their neighbor, a woman in her 50s named Margaret, had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. She was known for being strict, always keeping an eye on everyone around her. Margaret had never liked the idea of new people moving into the area, especially people who didn't look like her. From the moment she saw the Thomas family, she started to watch them carefully, making sure they fit in. Margaret didn't welcome them with a warm smile like most neighbors would. Instead, she watched from her window, judging everything they did. Every move the family made seemed to make her more suspicious. It didn't take long before Margaret decided to act on her suspicion. She didn't even try to get to know them or talk to them first. Instead, she made a quick decision. She picked up her phone and called the police. Margaret's voice was full of concern as she spoke to the dispatcher. But the truth was, there was no real reason for the police to be called. She wasn't reporting a crime. She was reporting people she didn't trust, simply because they didn't look like the people who had lived there before. "I think there's something strange going on in my neighborhood," Margaret told the dispatcher. "There's a new family across the street, and I don't think they belong here. You should send someone to check it out." And with that, the police were on their way. Meanwhile, the Thomas family was unaware of what was happening. They continued their unpacking, excited about their new home and hopeful that this would be the beginning of a happy chapter in their lives. But when they heard a knock on the door just an hour later, everything changed. The Thomas family had spent weeks packing and preparing for this move. It wasn't their first, but it felt like a fresh start. The Black family had been dreaming of a place like this, a safe, peaceful neighborhood where they could raise their kids and enjoy life. David, the father, had recently accepted a new job in the city, which gave them the opportunity to finally settle in a community that seemed ideal. They were excited, hopeful, and eager for what lay ahead. David, a hard-working man in his early 30s, was the first in his family to go to college. He had worked tirelessly to reach where he was, and now had the chance to provide his family with a better life. His wife Lena was equally excited. She had always wanted a house with a backyard, a space for her kids to play and grow. Zoe, their 8-year-old daughter, and Isaiah, their 5-year-old son, were also happy about the move. They loved the idea of making new friends and having a place to call their own. Their new home was everything they had hoped for. It was in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood with tree-lined streets and neatly manicured lawns. The houses were beautiful, and the sense of community was strong. At least, that's how it appeared at first glance. David and Lena couldn't wait to settle in, decorate the house, and start enjoying their new life. But as they began unpacking, they noticed something odd. As they went about their business, Margaret, their next-door neighbor, began to watch them. At first, it seemed like a casual glance, but soon it became clear that Margaret wasn't just curious. She was judging. Every time David and Lena stepped outside, Margaret's eyes would be on them, and sometimes they could feel her stare from across the street when they didn't notice. They weren't sure what it was, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Margaret, in her 50s, had lived in the neighborhood for more than 20 years. To her, this neighborhood was her territory, and she didn't like change. She had seen plenty of families come and go over the years, but none of them ever stood out like the Thomas family. They didn't fit her idea of who should live in a place like this, and without getting to know them, without even speaking a word to them, Margaret decided she didn't want them there. Margaret was known for her harsh judgments. She'd made it clear to others in the neighborhood that she thought certain people didn't belong. If anyone acted out of place in her eyes, she would make sure they knew it. She had already made her mind up about the Thomas family. Despite the fact that they were kind, respectful, and hadn't done anything to deserve her scrutiny, they were just trying to settle in. But Margaret, through her biased lens, saw their presence as unwelcome. The tension grew day by day as Margaret watched the family from her window. Every time she saw them enjoying themselves in their new home, her discomfort grew. The fact that David and Lena were happy and relaxed made her uneasy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had to be done. This was her neighborhood, and she wasn't about to let people like them disrupt it. One afternoon, after watching David and Lena for a while, Margaret made a decision. She reached for her phone and called the police, all the while convinced that she was doing the right thing. The Thomas family didn't know it, but Margaret had been watching them for weeks. She wasn't calling the cops because of a real problem. There was no threat, no danger. She was calling because she was uncomfortable with the idea of a black family moving into her neighborhood. In her eyes, the presence of people who didn't look like her was a problem. "I think something's going on next door," Margaret said into the phone, her voice dripping with suspicion. "They don't belong here. There's something strange about this family." Her accusations were vague and baseless. She couldn't point to a single issue, other than the fact that they were a new family and they weren't like her. But to Margaret, that was enough. She didn't have to prove her suspicions. In her mind, she had already decided they were guilty of disrupting the peace. She demanded that the police come and investigate. The dispatcher on the other end of the line seemed confused at first, but Margaret insisted that the officers come check on the family, making it sound as if something terrible was happening. The fact that no crime had been committed didn't matter to her. She just couldn't stand the fact that David and Lena Thomas were living next door. When the police officer arrived at the Thomas family's door, they were caught off guard. It wasn't long before they realized that Margaret had called them, but at that moment, they still had no idea why. David answered the door, his expression calm but confused. The officer introduced himself, but the suspicion in his eyes was already clear. The way he looked at David was cold, like he had already made up his mind about what was going on. David was surprised. He hadn't expected a visit from the police, certainly not for something as petty as this. He tried to remain calm, explaining that they had just moved in, and that there had been some misunderstanding. The officer, however, wasn't listening closely. He had already been told by the neighbor that something was wrong. In his mind, the bias had already been planted. Lena joined David at the door, and the two of them tried to explain themselves, but the officer wasn't paying much attention. He asked them questions about their background, as if being new to the neighborhood automatically made them suspicious. His questions weren't about what they had done. They were about who they were. The officer stood there, looking at them with doubt in his eyes. They could feel the tension growing. David could see the disrespect in the officer's posture, but he remained calm. "We're just trying to settle in. We're not causing any trouble," David said. But just as the officer was about to make a decision, something strange began to happen. He started to feel like there was more to this situation than he had initially thought. There was something in the way David and Lena carried themselves, something that made him question his first impression. The officer began to doubt the racist neighbor's claims. Was this family really as dangerous as Margaret had made them out to be? As the officer stood at the door, the air felt thick with tension. The Thomas family was still processing what was happening. They had never expected their peaceful move to be interrupted like this, and certainly not by the police. All they had done was move into their new home, excited to start fresh and build a better life. But there they were, trying to explain themselves to an officer who didn't seem to believe them. The officer's eyes moved from David to Lena and then to their kids, Zoe and Isaiah, who were standing quietly behind their parents. David, trying to remain calm, spoke up first. "Sir, we just moved in. We haven't done anything wrong." The officer nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. "I'm just here to follow up on a report." He looked at his notepad and then back at them. "There's been a complaint about suspicious activity coming from this house." Lena, frustrated but keeping her cool, stepped forward. "Suspicious activity? We've just moved in. We're unpacking, trying to get settled." The officer didn't respond. He looked at the two kids, wondering if they were hiding something. The tension in the air was heavy, and David could feel his heart rate speeding up. What was going on? Why was this happening? "I don't know why you're here, officer, but we're not causing any trouble," David said firmly, hoping to get through to him. But just then, the officer's eyes flickered. He glanced over his shoulder toward the street where the neighbor, Margaret, stood, watching from her window. It was like a silent signal, like he was waiting for her approval before taking further action. He shifted his weight on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. Lena noticed this, and her suspicion grew. She had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, and she could tell the officer wasn't taking them seriously. They were being judged. But for what? All because they were a black family in a neighborhood where they clearly didn't belong in Margaret's eyes. David saw the officer's hesitation, but he couldn't understand why he hadn't yet dismissed the complaint. Why was he still questioning them? Margaret had clearly made her intentions known to the officer, and he was now on edge, unsure of how to move forward. But the more Lena and David spoke, the more the officer seemed to hesitate. "I've been watching you," the officer said quietly, almost like he was trying to justify his actions. "You don't seem like you belong here." The words hit them like a slap. It wasn't about anything they had done. It wasn't about any real suspicion or crime. It was about their appearance, their skin color. Margaret's influence on the officer was clear, and it was frustrating to see. David's patience was running thin. "We don't need to prove anything to you. We live here. We've done nothing wrong, and we're just trying to settle in." Lena stood firm beside him, making it clear that she wasn't backing down. "I don't know what your issue is, officer, but this family deserves respect." Her voice was calm but filled with a quiet strength. She wasn't angry. She was simply standing up for her family. The officer, clearly unsettled by their calm but firm response, looked down at his notepad again. But just as he started to speak, a voice called out from the street. "Officer! Stop!" The officer turned around, his hand going to his belt. The voice was louder now, cutting through the tension in the air. "What is going on here?" It was a man walking toward them. He was tall, dressed in a suit, and had an air of authority. The officer immediately recognized him. The man had a presence that couldn't be ignored. "Sir, I'm Officer Matthews. I'm just responding to a report of some potential trouble," the officer began to explain. But the man, without even acknowledging the officer's response, walked right up to the Thomas family. He looked at David and Lena, then at the officer. The look on his face was clear. He wasn't happy. "You're the new neighbors, right?" he asked the Thomas family. David nodded, confused. "Yes, we just moved in." The officer stood there, looking uncertain, his eyes flicking from the man to the family. Who was this? Why was this stranger intervening? The man extended his hand to David. "I'm Charles Turner," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I believe we've been misinformed." The officer looked surprised. Charles Turner. The name rang a bell, but it took him a second to connect the dots. The CEO of a major corporation? The influential businessman who was known for his work in the community? The officer was speechless. He hadn't expected this. He had been so quick to listen to Margaret, assuming she was right, assuming that the new family was in the wrong. But now, standing before him was someone far more important than the neighbor. Charles Turner wasn't just anyone. He was someone who could have him reassigned with a single phone call. Charles Turner turned back to the officer, his voice cold but composed. "You've been misinformed. This family is not causing any problems. In fact, they're my neighbors, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't make assumptions about them based on their appearance." The officer was now on the spot. He had been played by the racist neighbor who had fed him lies and false accusations. The situation that he had assumed would be easy to handle had turned into something far more complex. Margaret, watching from her window, had no idea that the very person she had tried to turn against the Thomas family was now the one who could undo everything she had done. The officer stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. He had been called to the Thomas family's home because of a racist accusation from their neighbor, Margaret. He had arrived expecting to find trouble, to confirm the false story that had been told to him, but what he found instead was a family who was completely innocent and had every right to be in the neighborhood. And now, standing in front of him was Charles Turner, someone he recognized and respected. The officer knew he had made a serious mistake. Charles Turner wasn't just any man. He was one of the most respected individuals in the community. As the CEO of Turner Enterprises, he had built a reputation for standing up for what was right. He had a voice that carried weight, a presence that commanded respect. And now, he was standing up for the Thomas family. The officer's heart raced as he realized he had been caught in a lie. Margaret had misled him, and now the truth was coming to light. The officer had a decision to make. Would he own up to his mistake, or would he continue to side with the neighbor who had falsely accused the family? "Officer Matthews, I believe you've been given some wrong information," Charles Turner said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to the officer and then back to David and Lena. "This family is part of our community now, and I'm going to make sure they're treated with the respect they deserve." David and Lena stood there in shock, trying to process everything. They had expected the officer to listen to them, to believe them, but they hadn't expected this man, this powerful, respected man, to come to their defense. The weight of what was happening didn't fully sink in until they saw the officer's face. The officer, who had been ready to confront them, now seemed small, unsure of himself. "You should have listened to them from the beginning, officer," Charles Turner continued. "You've been misinformed by someone who has made baseless claims. This family has every right to be here." The officer didn't know how to respond. He had been trained to handle situations like this, to enforce the law, but now he realized how wrong he had been. He had let his own bias cloud his judgment. The officer had believed the neighbor's accusations without thinking critically about them. But, standing here now, facing Charles Turner's unwavering confidence, he knew he had no excuse. "I understand, sir. I made a mistake," Officer Matthews said, his voice quieter now, filled with regret. He turned toward David and Lena. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. This was never meant to escalate like this." But the apology came too late. The damage had already been done. The officer had crossed a line. The community was watching, and his actions would not be forgotten. Charles Turner's face softened slightly. "I hope you've learned something today, Officer Matthews. It's important to question our assumptions and make sure we're not being influenced by prejudice. This could have been handled differently if you had only taken the time to listen." David looked at Charles, feeling a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Gratitude for the support, and disbelief that the situation had escalated to this point because of a racist neighbor's lies. "Thank you for standing up for us, sir," David said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Charles Turner gave him a reassuring smile. "It's the least I can do. We all have to stand up against racism and injustice no matter where we see it." The officer nodded, clearly humbled by the situation. He wasn't just apologizing to the family, he was apologizing to himself for his own bias. He had failed to see the truth, and he now understood that he needed to be better. The officer turned to leave, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his actions. He had come to this house thinking he was doing his duty, but now he was leaving with the realization that he had been wrong. His bias had influenced his judgment, and it had almost cost an innocent family their peace. As Officer Matthews walked away, Margaret, who had been watching from her window the whole time, stepped outside. She looked at the officer with a smug expression, waiting for him to confirm her suspicions. But when the officer walked past her without a word, her expression faltered. She had expected him to back her up, to confirm her racism, but instead, she was met with silence. Margaret looked toward the Thomas family's house, then back at the officer. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth had caught up with her. The officer had not only failed to support her accusations, but he had also shown the world that her lies had been exposed. David and Lena watched the officer leave, their relief palpable. They were thankful that Charles Turner had stepped in and made sure they were treated with dignity and respect. But as they looked at Margaret, standing across the street, they knew the battle wasn't over. Margaret's prejudices would still linger, and they would have to continue facing her cold stares and judgments. But now, they felt empowered. They weren't alone anymore. "I guess this isn't over yet," David said quietly, turning to Lena. "But at least we know we have people in our corner." Lena nodded, smiling softly. "We have to keep fighting. This is just the beginning." As the officer's car drove away, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a little easier. Margaret, standing alone, watched as the Thomas family remained in their home, unbowed, ready to move forward. The truth had prevailed, and it was clear to everyone watching that racism and prejudice would no longer be tolerated. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. What began as a small, quiet incident had turned into something much bigger. The moment Charles Turner intervened, things had changed. The officer who had walked into the Thomas family's home with his bias now faced the reality of his actions. He had been caught off guard by the truth, and he couldn't ignore the fact that he had made a serious mistake. As the officer drove away, he could feel the weight of what he had just witnessed. He had been forced to question his assumptions, forced to realize that his actions had been shaped by prejudices he hadn't even realized he held. It was an uncomfortable feeling for someone in his position, but as much as it embarrassed him, it was a lesson learned, and one he would have to live with. Meanwhile, Margaret stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed tightly, looking like she had just lost a battle she thought she had already won. She had spent the last few days watching the Thomas family through her window, convinced that they didn't belong. Now, as the officer walked past her without saying a word, her smug expression faded. Margaret had expected him to take her side, to believe her accusations. Instead, he had sided with the truth, and the reality of the situation was settling in. Margaret stood there, frozen for a moment, as the weight of her actions began to hit her. She had tried to make the Thomas family feel unwelcome, to cast them out based on nothing more than her personal bias. She had assumed she knew who belonged and who didn't. But now, with everything out in the open, she realized how wrong she had been. David and Lena stood in front of their home, watching as Charles Turner walked back toward them. He had made sure that the officer understood the mistake he had made, but Charles wasn't done yet. He knew that, for things to truly change, the whole community had to recognize what had happened here. It wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about changing the way people viewed race and community. And Charles Turner wasn't going to let it slide. "David, Lena," Charles said, turning to them with a look of determination, "I want you to know that I'm going to make sure this never happens again." David looked at Charles, grateful, but still in shock. "We can't thank you enough for stepping in. This is more than we ever expected." Charles smiled. "You didn't expect anything, David. You just expected to live your life in peace, and that's exactly what you should be able to do." But Charles knew this wasn't just about one encounter. It wasn't enough for the officer to simply apologize. He had to make sure that what had happened didn't get swept under the rug. Racism and prejudice had no place in this neighborhood, and Charles was determined to make sure everyone knew that. As Charles was about to speak more, the door to Margaret's house opened. She stepped outside, her posture stiff and defensive. She could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on her, but she couldn't back down now. She had spent years cultivating her image as the neighborhood watchdog, and now it seemed like that was all coming crashing down. "I need to say something," Margaret called out to the group. David and Lena exchanged a quick glance. They had been through so much already, but they were tired of Margaret's behavior and the way she had tried to make their family feel unwelcome. Now, Margaret wanted to speak. Charles Turner stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "What do you need to say, Margaret?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the attention now on her, but she knew she had to say something. She had caused this, and it was time to take responsibility. She cleared her throat and spoke, though her voice trembled slightly. "I was wrong." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "I let my feelings get in the way of the truth. I've been unfair to this family, and I apologize." David and Lena stood silent, processing the apology. It wasn't easy for anyone, but hearing it was a start. Margaret's apology wasn't just for them. It was a chance for the community to heal. Charles Turner nodded, looking at Margaret with a steady gaze. "This is a good first step, Margaret. But now, you need to do more. You need to help this neighborhood understand that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Margaret nodded slowly, realizing that the road ahead would be a long one. She had to rebuild the trust she had lost, not just with the Thomas family, but with the entire community. The people who had once looked up to her now saw her for who she truly was, a person who had let fear and bias guide her actions. David stepped forward and spoke, his voice steady. "We accept your apology, Margaret, but we need everyone to understand that racism doesn't have a place here. We don't want to live in a neighborhood where people feel uncomfortable just because of who they are." Lena added, "And we want our children to grow up in a place where they are treated with respect, not suspicion." The neighborhood had been silent for too long, but now change was happening. Margaret's apology was just the beginning. The people around them had to acknowledge the reality of racism and take action to make sure it didn't happen again. As the conversation began to quiet down, Charles Turner turned back to David and Lena. "This won't be easy, but it's a fight worth having, and I'll be here to make sure we all do the right thing." The weight of what had just happened hung in the air. The officer had been humbled, Margaret had apologized, and the community had been forced to reckon with its own prejudices. The road to healing would take time, but with people like David, Lena, and Charles leading the way, there was hope. David and Lena knew it wasn't just about one officer's mistake or even about Margaret's apology. This was about something bigger, something that could change the way everyone in the neighborhood thought. They weren't just fighting for their own peace. They were fighting for everyone's peace. The days that followed were filled with reflection and a sense of change that no one had expected. What started as a small issue between a racist neighbor and a new family had snowballed into something much bigger. It was a moment of awakening, not just for David, Lena, and their children, but for everyone in the community. Margaret's apology was a step toward healing, but it wasn't enough. Action had to follow. The apology alone couldn't erase the hurt that had been caused, or the feelings of fear and suspicion that had been stirred up by her false accusations. The real work was about to begin, and it would take time for the neighborhood to heal fully. Charles Turner, with his influence and commitment to making things right, took it upon himself to make sure this wasn't swept under the rug. The community needed to face what had happened and decide how they would move forward. Racism, whether overt or subtle, could no longer be ignored. Charles arranged a community meeting that would bring everyone together to discuss the incident and what needed to change. He invited everyone in the neighborhood, from longtime residents to the new families, to come and talk about the situation. The meeting was going to be difficult, but it was necessary. On the evening of the meeting, people filled the room. Some looked uncomfortable, others were unsure of what they were about to hear. But Charles, David, and Lena knew that this was a crucial moment. The tension in the room was palpable, but the fact that people had shown up was a sign that change was possible. The meeting began with Charles standing at the front, speaking to the group. His voice was calm, but his words carried strength. What happened with the Thomas family was not just an unfortunate incident, it's a sign of a much deeper issue. We've allowed fear and prejudice to take root in our community, and it's time for that to change. There was a hush in the room as everyone listened closely. Some people shifted in their seats feeling uncomfortable, but Charles wasn't backing down. We all need to take a hard look at how we've treated others, especially those who are different from us. We need to do better. David and Lena stood beside him, their presence powerful. They had faced the anger and judgment of the community, but now they were standing with the people who wanted to make a difference. They weren't just victims of racism, they were part of the solution. David spoke next, his voice strong. "When we first moved here, we were excited to start a new life, but we were made to feel unwelcome, not because of anything we did, but simply because of how we looked, and that's not okay." Lena added, "We're just a family trying to live in peace. All we want is to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. We shouldn't have to prove our worth based on our skin color." The room was silent. People were listening now. The discomfort in the room was real, but it was also necessary. This was the conversation they had to have. This was the moment that would determine whether things would stay the same or change for the better. After a long pause, Margaret stood up. She looked at the crowd, her face filled with regret. "I have wronged you, David, Lena, and your children," she said. "I let my own fears and biases shape how I saw you, and for that, I am truly sorry. I want to do better, and I want to be part of making sure this never happens again." Her apology wasn't easy for her. It was hard to admit that she had been wrong, that she had let her prejudice control her actions. But in that moment, she was choosing to take responsibility for the harm she had caused. It wasn't enough to say sorry. She needed to show the community that she would change. The room was quiet for a moment, but then a few people started to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew, slowly, as people began to recognize that Margaret's apology wasn't just about her. It was about the whole community coming to terms with the fact that prejudice had taken root and that it was time to uproot it. Charles Turner spoke again, this time more forcefully. This is just the beginning. Apologies are important, but actions speak louder. We need to work together to build a community that is inclusive, welcoming, and free from racism. It's not going to be easy, but we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to make this change. The meeting continued late into the night with people expressing their thoughts and feelings. Some were hesitant to speak at first, but as others shared their experiences, they began to find the courage to share their own. People spoke of the need for understanding, compassion, and the desire to grow together as a community. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to change. Charles helped organize events where neighbors could get to know each other, share their stories, and learn from each other. The community came together in ways they hadn't before. People from different backgrounds, races, and experiences started to build friendships, and conversations that had once been avoided were now happening openly. Margaret, who had once been the source of division, worked hard to make things right. She volunteered to help with neighborhood events, offering to help new families feel welcome, and taking on leadership roles in organizing gatherings for everyone in the area. She knew it would take time to rebuild her reputation, but she was determined to be a part of the solution, not the problem. David and Lena, though they still felt some discomfort in the community, were encouraged by the changes they saw. They knew it wasn't perfect, but they also knew that their willingness to stand up for what was right had sparked something important. Their actions had opened the door to conversations that needed to happen. The Thomas family now felt like they truly belonged in the neighborhood, and it was clear that their efforts were making a difference. People were beginning to see them as more than just the new neighbors. They were part of a larger conversation about racism, respect, and inclusion. The community had taken its first steps toward healing, and David and Lena were proud to be a part of it. In the end, the Thomas family's move, which had started out as a hopeful new beginning, turned into a catalyst for change. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but the neighborhood was no longer the same. They had learned the hard way that racism could no longer be ignored, and they had taken action to change things for the better. The story of the Thomas family and their experience in the neighborhood wasn't just an isolated incident. It became a lesson for everyone who heard about it, a lesson about standing up against prejudice, facing bias, and making sure everyone is treated with respect. For the Thomas family, it was a victory, but also a reminder that the battle isn't over. They didn't just overcome Margaret's false accusations. They sparked an entire community-wide awakening about the impact of racism and how easily prejudices can influence people's behavior. Now, we need to ask ourselves, what would we have done in their place? How would we have acted if we were David and Lena, trying to stay calm when wrongly accused, or if we were the officer who had to confront his own biases? We all have a responsibility to speak out against injustice when we see it. Whether it's in our communities, workplaces, or even on the street, we must stand up and make sure that racism and discrimination don't go unchallenged. It starts with us, with each of us, taking the first step to create a fairer, kinder world. We want to hear from you. What would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stepped up like David, Lena, and Charles did? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation. Your voice matters. It matters to the people around you, and it matters to creating a future where everyone is treated equally, regardless of their background, race, or where they come from. We all have the power to make a difference in our communities and our world. If this story moved you, please share it with your friends, family, and social networks. Let's spread the word that standing up for what is right is never wrong. Together, we can inspire others to take action and create change, one person at a time. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. We will continue to bring you stories that inspire change, challenge the status quo, and remind us all that we have a voice that can make a difference. Thank you for watching, and remember, we all have the power to create a better world, starting right where we are.